it's a good time to do a bit of introduction. I want to welcome everybody to the first public lecture of not only of the semester, but first public lecture in face-to-face on campus since, I guess, February of 2020, right? February 29th, leap year, is when everything changed, and at least for us. And so this is really wonderful. I see a lot of faculty here, and I appreciate that a lot. You're here to welcome new faculty, and we appreciate that as well. So I'm going to do a quick introduction. I even took a few notes, otherwise I'd be talking too long. For those of you who don't know, Natalie and Cruz have a practice they call WAI, or WAI, think tank. It's a partnership that advocates for social and human equity in spatial and social practices and studies the exercise of power in all its guises affecting the political, economic, policy practices related to architecture and the built environment. They put it like this on their website: the practice questions political, historical, and material legacy and imperatives of architecture and urbanism. We see this if you have visited their site. If you have not, you should. It's just WAI Think Tank right here. We see this in certain other works, for instance, Anti-Racist Manifesto, and they also have an anti-racist educational manual. I want to say that during the period where the issues of, after George Floyd, after Black Lives Matter, when architecture organizations, whether or not it was the AIA, the American Institute of Architects, or our collegiate organization, the ACSA, when people were scrambling to put out statements about how the discipline of architecture should position itself in relation to these major social, political, human, ethical concerns, they were out with the Anti-Racist Manifesto. I think it had probably been in their work for so long, and they voiced it. They voiced it faster, stronger, and with more precision and insight than anyone. And I don't mean to flatter you, because we're in Holland and you're not supposed to flatter people. I can't flatter Tom Leslie, he hates it. Very Iowa of him. But anyway, Natalie and Cruz have been practicing architecture for many years. They practiced in Europe and Belgium. In fact, I think the think tank started in Belgium. They practiced in Beijing. They practiced around the world. They were professor fellows at Carnegie Mellon. They were professor fellows at Lincoln, University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Recently, as they were packing and moving to come here, they also did a little stint at Columbia University, because heaven forbid they should take a break before they left one job at Virginia and started another here. I'm really pleased, everyone in the college is pleased, that because of them, we have an exhibition. We also haven't had an exhibition in the gallery in all this time. And so, as you all know, because we've received the announcements, the Planetary Wretched, a room of loud readers, this will be their talk tonight, but it is also the title of the exhibition, Post-Colonial Narrative in Architecture. I was speaking to them after they arrived, and we were talking about their work, and I said, how do I sum it up? And Cruz said, just use the word power. And I said, okay, I will never forget that again. I'll just think of Foucault, but it's not Foucault, but power. Please join me in welcoming our faculty, our new faculty, and our first public program lecture.
there's going to be a reception, and there's a show that, group show that we put out for all of you. We know that many people will come today and they've been sending emails because of COVID and they're afraid of being in rooms with other people. So luckily we'll have the exhibition there for some time and you'll have time to see it, but hopefully because we're here today we want to talk to you about it and so on. So today we have a sort of survey, a survey of our practice, a presentation of some of the questions that we've been asking and some of the ideas that we've been exploring in our work, and how does that relate also to our teaching, and how important it is to have a conversation with students, with our colleagues, and with other practitioners, right? Like, and you will see the exhibition is not only about our work, and it's something that really makes our practice, I think, like quite contemporary, is that with the passing of the years, the work we do is much less about us, and it becomes more about us at the same time, right? Like there's more people working together in generating all these questions. So the title is World Makers Unite, and that's the call, right? Like we are calling all of us to unite as world makers. A post-colonial guide to loud readers, and we're going to explain to you what loud readers is. What does it mean post-colonial for us, right? It's a particular concept we use in our work. And the first part.
So we divided the lecture in different parts, and the first part we named it Clinical Narrative, 1916-2008. The fully developed ability to say no is also the only valid background for yes, and only through both does real freedom begin to take form.
So, needless to say, as Deborah talked about, like this has been a very long 2020, right? We are still somehow embedded in the midst of all this. And something that has been really at the center of our work is been questioning what are the forces that are shaping the world around us also. What are the images that are being generated and the political and historical context in which we're in, right? What does it mean that somebody will borrow some sort of indigenous customs to generate some form of iconic figure, right? What does it mean that somebody's standing with the Confederate flag in front of the image of Charles Sumner, who was beat up, right, for going against the Confederation, right, against slaves, against the idea of slavery, and just because he was going against that, he was getting beat up in that image you can see there, right? What does it mean that oftentimes architects are at the center of systems of extraction and exploitation, right? And this is a phrase that I find it problematic since the beginning, but I find it even more problematic today, right? With the idea of neoliberalism and architects being unable to say no. You know, the Manifesto of the Archangels of Yes is More, right? And here, having a picture with Jair Bolsonaro that is basically the enemy of indigenous people in Brazil, right? And these are some of the really racist quotes he has used, saying that basically indigenous people are standing in the middle of development of Brazil, right? Standing on really rich, wealthy land, right? And he wants to get rid of them, right? And understanding what's the relationship to those really important ancestral forms of knowledge in relationship to the protection of ecodiversity around the world, right? So it's a direct relationship between one and the other, right? What does it mean that Elon Musk, when confronted with the idea that they are behind the coup in Bolivia, right? He kind of laughed and says, "We will coup whoever we want, so deal with it," right? Like a really unashamed phrase. And he said it as a model of joke, but it's not really a joke, right? When you think that behind many of the political moves around the world and many of the seismic changes in political atmosphere are always backed up by systems of extraction that are really interlinked with architecture, right? So that's something that really interests us. And this one that perhaps is the most nauseating, right, from the people that brought us chattel slavery and global sort of colonialism, an architect trying to redesign the planet, right? You know, as if we needed more people with a huge ego trying to take over the world, right? So when the article says that he's gonna do the master planet, sounds like a big plantation to me, right? So the question is, who are we, right? Or maybe who we are not, right? So Natalie and me met in Belgium in 2008, right? I even found this picture that somebody sent us the other day of us in our youthful years when we were full of naivete and youth. And after I arrived to Europe, 2 weeks later, Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy. So there was a crash on Wall Street, and many architects lost their jobs, like by the thousands or millions, right? Like it was a really ugly economic climate, not very different to what is happening now with COVID, right? Like a global interruption. These are the places where we have lived in the last 12 years, right? So we met in Belgium, live in the Netherlands. I come from Puerto Rico. Nathalie is French. We live after in France, moved to Beijing, where we were based for 7 years, right? So we were based on a city in the middle of modernity, in the sense that they were going through a really drastic change in the sense of policy, planning, architecture, right? And so this is our apartment in Beijing, just to show you how we live in a way. So it's almost like there's no separation between art and life in what we do. So everything is kind of embedded in one big sort of ball of mess. These are some of the events that we run in our apartment. So we went from being in a city of 20 million people one day, right? So this is the Guijie, the street where we live in Beijing. That is like a street with restaurants. And we went to bed here one day and then woke up the next day in the middle of Wisconsin when we moved to teach our first American teaching job in the what was known as the Frank Lloyd Wright School of Architecture in Taliesin, right? So all of a sudden we were not anymore in a city of 20 million people, but we were living in the middle of somehow the imagination of the American architecture collective imagination, right? In the house of the great American architect. So we were living in Wisconsin and we had to travel through the country to go to Arizona, to the other campus, right? So we were confronted with many of these incredible landscapes that are, you will see, have some relationship to your surroundings here in Iowa. And that was something that was really striking to us, the vast expansiveness of this continent in a way. Something we were not really familiar, coming from a place that had 20 million people, right? So then once we arrived to Taliesin, Arizona, we were somehow there also confronted with a history of questioning, right, that legacy of the architect as the single, sort of white male genius surrounded by a bunch of other men, designing architecture together, right? But only one of them getting the credit, right? So something that we were really interested while being in Taliesin was to really try to, if we could dismantle this, to question it, right? Like to find ways to work with the community, with our students, to do projects that are not necessarily aligning with that legacy of the single genius that is going to save the world through architecture, right? One of the projects we did was to start a magazine that didn't have to do with Frank Lloyd Wright. We almost lost our lives doing that, right? It was a very hard fight at the beginning to convince people that there's more out there than that sort of genius or whatever. And the funny thing now is that it's the longest running project. The school moved to Tanto Arco Santi, and the magazine is still running, and they already have gotten 2 grants from the Graham Foundation. So what started as a fight, right, for us to try to convince the students and the community to look outside of the contained knowledge of Frank Lloyd Wright became something that put the legacy much further than just the institution. We were doing workshops with high school students, and eventually our first year students, end up doing some really amazing thesis projects where they were questioning the legacy of the place, right? Like in this case, kind of making fun of the materials in a sort of humorous way, or exploring dark ecologies, or exploring the construction methods on the site. This is an image Connor did in first year, when we were teaching them how to do collage, and then his thesis project in the third year. I think it's really nice relationship, or sort of exploring object-oriented ontology in the desert. And again, when we were talking to you, this is a documentary that appears in the BBC that is the same problem, right? The same problem of this title has so much to unpack. Frank Lloyd Wright, the man who built America, Just think about how problematic it is. I'm not talking about that for sure, right? I'm talking about like questioning and seeing the things that are valuable, that are actually the things that were critical of him, not necessarily all the aesthetics and all the sort of manifesto. Like many institutions, the school was forced to leave because of neoliberalism, among other things. And this makes us jump to another sort of parallel questioning of history, right? When we finished school was 2008, the 40th anniversary of 1968, right? The protests in Paris, in Mexico City, all around the world, right? Things from the like gay rights movement with Stonewall to the streets of Paris to the civil rights movement, right? And understanding what are the parallels between that period and now, right? Especially for the students going to a world that is in disarray in a way, right? Where can you find in history other periods that can give you some sort of model to follow? What are the questions that have been asked that we must address somehow, right? So we were really interested in looking at the history and also trying to understand how little have things changed, really, right? I always look at that meme and I laugh when I see it. That says, I cannot believe that I'm still fighting for this shit, right? It's like this Baltimore in a period of 50 years in between. 50. Nothing has changed, right? Some of the basic human rights we're still asking for them, right? Somehow, who is at the center of these struggles, right? Black women being at the center, queer women, trans women, right? Like, who are the people that are really leading us, that are not those fragile rights of life? Where can we look for new paradigms that are trying to take us away from our sort of condition of being stuck in time, right? Who are the people who have put their life on the line for us to be emancipated, right? Understanding how lucky we are today, that I don't have to be lecturing behind bulletproof screens, right? Because this is a fact of life, right? That you're asking difficult questions. So many people lost their lives, so we could be here today in a way, and I'm not taking that lightly, right? Understanding, all the many indigenous struggles that have been going to spaces and claim, the role of architecture in systems of oppression here, indigenous people taking over Alcatraz in '69, right? And understanding how these struggles are not necessarily just in the United States or in Puerto Rico or in France, but it's a global condition, right? A global condition that goes beyond the places where we're in, or even what we know, right? Understanding who are those icons at the centers of those struggles. Understanding how embedded are systems of colonialism and extraction and exploitation, predation and capture, with art, right? With the things that we love, right? We don't have computers if we're not extracting rare earth somewhere else, right? There's no architectural movements if the Europeans are not in Africa and in the Americas, right? So what are the ecological effects of this? What is the colonial footprint that we have in the world when we're working with our tools and media? I love this painting, not because I don't like the painting itself with the aesthetics, but it's a painting by William Turner. But what is crazy about this painting, or problematic, if you want to think about, is not only the content of it, right? We can see some little arms here and some chains, right? This is a depiction of a slave ship throwing the slaves overboard so they can be eaten, right? So the slave owner can claim the insurance. This actually happened, right? And William Turner painted. But what is problematic about this painting is not the painting itself or the content of it. It's that the family that owned it, a family from Boston, sold the painting to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and with the money they got from the painting, I think it was like $47,000, bought a sugar plantation and mill in Puerto Rico, right? So the money that funded a depiction of horrible cruelty is funding another form of horrible cruelty in reality, right? So it's not only that the things we do may affect symbolically, but they also are funded by economies of exploitation, right? So that's really also really interesting. And now to define what the postcolonial means for us. Actually, Bembe talks about the postcolony as a system of extraction, tendency to excess, improvisation, right? For us, the postcolony is not that. For us, the post-colony is what happens when the radiance of cruelty, brutality, improvisation, extraction, exploitation that were so typical in the Caribbean and in the plantations become the norm everywhere else, right? So when you don't have to be in the plantation to suffer and die and to feel like the government doesn't care about you, right? Or that somehow you're risking your life for being somewhere, right? Puerto Rico is the oldest colony in the world. It has been a colony over 500 years, right? So what we feel is that whatever we experience with the hurricanes, where people lost their lives and they don't even count, is very similar to what's happening with COVID, right? So whatever happened in the colonies at some point, where death is just a number, it's pretty happening everywhere. In New York, right? In Brazil, in India, right? So it's not shocking to see this image in the Amazon and this image in New York are so similar. That's what the post-colonial means to us, right? The colony is everywhere. You don't have to go into the Caribbean anymore to count the bodies. From this, there's a new imagination emerging, right? And that's what we find really inspiring and hopeful, right? Especially for students, right? I love this t-shirt from the Feminist Collective in Construction in Puerto Rico that reads, anti-patriarchal, feminist, lesbian, trans, Caribbean, Latin American. I feel like that's the manifesto of our times, right? Like that's what's going to lead us somewhere. Understanding who are the people that have been standing in the center of all these struggles, you know, Black Lives Matter, for dignifying access to life. Understanding where do we stand as architects, right? When we are questioned if a building has more value than Black life, or indigenous life, or trans life, right? Our role in systems of oppression, right? Systems of incarceration, the industrial carceral system that incarcerates exponential numbers of Black and Latino people, right? What happens when we are embedded in those systems and we are the ones that are fabricating the structures that do this, right? The walls that divide us and the destruction of the environment, right? Who is at the center of those struggles? And what are the truly democratic forms of architecture, right? When people come together to bring down monuments that were never democratically erected, right? When they're put there as signs of some systems of oppression.
Part 2, La Readers, 1920-2020. The only purpose of education is to make new worlds collectively. This requires the practice of curiosity as a daily habit and the exercise of dignified and purposeful rebelliousness. Other worlds are possible.
And we like to start to talk about a bit about post-colonial landscape, right? We talk about what the post-colonial is, but what is the imagination that is born out of the images that we have consumed for a long time? Images of erasure, right? As Alexander von Humboldt invited many painters to paint the landscapes to be discovered, right? Landscapes that already have people in them, most of the times, right? Like that these acts of erasure and disappearance, right? Like especially with the what we can call the disappearing Indian, right? And all these landscapes that are always somehow like postcards for settlers. We like to somehow subvert that and reinsert the ideological architectures, right? Like reinsert them with militarized architectures, right? When we see this image by John Gast, where indigenous people are being pushed out, right, by the white women with the school book and all the sort of settlers with all the technology and the farming and the cities, right? We're really interested in finding those empty landscapes, the artifacts of the occupation, right? So part of a series of exhibitions and events that we have done deal with that idea of the post-colonial landscape, right? On the landscape that reinserts the militarized architecture. Landscapes that tell a story of occupation, right? Where you find heads of literal heads of states, and architecture that have been reclaimed to tell a story of militarization, a story of interruption of nature. We have developed
creates an echo if I have both at the same time. So we also founded a collective. So Cruz spoke about the importance of working collectively in our work. And a new collective is called Post-Novice. We have collaborators from many different fields. Some of them are also with students of us before. And the idea was to work together in creating series of events, series of projects that would also question this relationship to landscape. We have collaborators from many different places, which also allows us to challenge again this idea of Alexander von Humboldt and the foreign expert that comes in another territory, and really try to engage with landscapes and different places and different projects and people in many different locations. So we did a series in Nebraska, so that's an example of one of the first installation of Post-Novice we did, where every student reclaim tools of the avant-garde, building architectons, asking also new contemporary questions out of it, and referring to different types of tools, movie making, publication making, and also having a series of public loud readings that would take place in the space where we would invite everybody to come and to join the conversation. We also, that's actually one of the last lecture we did in person, which was a long time ago, 2 years ago at Carnegie Mellon, where we had the opportunity to change the stage into a post-novice world-making event installation, where we would invite the public also to become world makers and join post-novice. So we had a series of videos and also working with the idea of creating dialogue between people, so also challenging the idea of a lecture. One of the latest projects we did with the Post-Novice Collective, which is actually presented in the gallery later on, so you're going to be able to see one version of the play, the movie part, is Post-Novice Unite, a post-colonial play, which developed in different parts and different scenes, a narrative about the idea of world making.
So basically, these landscapes are not only reclaiming those historical depictions of the erasure, right, but reinserting architecture at the center of it, but they also are tools that allow us to collaborate with writers, artists, while everybody is making actions in this play, right? So one of the pieces that you will see in the exhibition is the play. Another really interesting collaboration that was born during COVID, and I think this is also a great example to the students to think about what do we do with what we have, like when you have Zoom, when you have YouTube and Facebook and Instagram. Our dear friend Randy Cool has a shoe brand called United Nude, where they make basically architectural shoes and cars too now. And we've been wanting to collaborate for some time, and somehow we started collaborating during COVID. And he invited us, he basically commissioned us to make his new lookbook for a season that started during COVID basically, even if we wanted to start that before, but COVID kind of, rather than interrupting the project, created a different type of project. And the idea was, how can we combine his exploration of form together with our post-colonial narratives, right? So this is the card that Elon Musk ripped from him, actually. And these are some of the things that were working, and somehow they relate a lot to our work, especially to our research on form. And for us, it was kind of funny and intimidating at the same time, right? Because as somebody that works with really amazing designers and models, which we are not, right? Working with Iris Van Herpen or Sean Ross, Aisha Miyake, and Zaha Hadid, what type of contribution we can do. And so he invited us to become the models and the designers of the thing, right? So we went in our backyard, and this again like a kind of homemade project, where we were posing with the shoes, and we were our own stylists, right? And we developed a series that then after we mixed with music. It's too loud, sorry. That's the loudest frog ever. know that this has a volume here, right? So we pick up some of the sounds of the local frogs in Puerto Rico, like the coquí. Right, now it's less loud. And then we started mixing music. And then kind of through the work of poetry that we're going to present you later.
A fantastic odyssey. A narrative in 10 scenes.
Right, and it goes, and then we start developing this series of sort of postcards, right, where we're reinserting ourselves in those landscapes we were talking about. So it became kind of the lookbook of the brand for the 2020 season, right? And it's a kind of feature there. And then you can follow the whole documentation of all these landscapes. So in a way, it's like instead of hiding the designer, it became like at the center of the work. I think it was a really interesting sort of collaboration between a fashion company and a pair of designers. And then at the end, we end up with a video that it was combining all those projects.
A fantastic odyssey. A narrative in 10 scenes. Among geometric stage.
If you go to the video, it goes
like
to
the sun and water.
If you go to the video, it goes to the points, right? This also kept developing in our play, and again, you will see some of the videos in the exhibition, but we had the chance to do, we commissioned somehow through our research funds, some of the members of Postnovis to develop actions that were shown in a 360 screen in the Museum of Fine Arts in Blacksburg. So we have a play during COVID that changed somehow how plays are performed, right? So it was performed digitally in this sort of 360 stage. I think also that was a really interesting discovery, especially because some of the members are based in Vienna or in Hong Kong, in Nebraska, while we were in Virginia, Puerto Rico, right? And many of these people are working with very different symbols. So when you go to the exhibition, you will find some of the things they use. So one of the members of the collective, Luis Otoniel Rosa, that is a writer, a fiction writer, professor at the University of Nebraska. He works a lot with anarchist collectives in Poland, for example, that were called the Orange Dwarfs or something like that, and they were like kind of Smurfs. So he uses Smurfs to sort of insert all these anarchist and sort of manifestos of mutual aid and subversivity. Rosemary Florian working with the legacy of the builder, you know, and the sort of the in relationship to the body of the black woman, or Ophelia Shan developing a series of feminist manifestos in relationship to the image of female characters in film, historical film, especially in Asian film. She's a Hong Kongese artist. Holly Craig working with the idea of the corn landscapes in Nebraska, and Hilary Wiese also working with a long legacy of avant-garde feminist practices. This is also part of the project. Is the last action, is an epilogue done in collaboration by students of 3 land-grant universities, from the University of Berkeley in California, University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and Virginia Tech. So it's a really long mural, and you will also see it on the video. And this brings us to the platform of loud readers, right? And I will ask you, what's the difference between the left picture and the right picture, right? Can somebody tell me? What's missing in the left picture? Women. There's no women, right? That's the Bauhaus in a nutshell for you, right? Walter Gropius was a pretty sexist person, right? They thought that women couldn't think in 3 dimensions, right? And there's a full design school based on all these separations between disciplines, right? Interiors, things that belong to the domestic space, and so on. And that's something that we find really problematic, that we learn so much about the Bauhaus, but we ignore other schools that were happening at the same time, right? If we look at the diagram of the Bauhaus and we replace it for what women were allowed to do versus men, this is what happens. right? Men are the center with architecture, and in the top, right? And women are with the remaining disciplines, right? And this is the lithograph that Gropius made, if you translate it to who was allowed to do what, right? So we're really interested in other practices that happen at the same time, rather than the Bauhaus, right? Other forms of modernities. For example, the People's Art School in Vitebsk, where it was one of the first collectives in design, basically, in art, where people were working together, and they were not even signing with their name. They were signing as a collective, right? When we talk about post-novice before, it's basically borrowing the name, right? The post-colonial and novice. That is the collective that was founded here in the People's Art School of Vitebsk, right? Vera Monaeva, that is there, she was the director of the school in 2020, right? At the same time that Gropius was in the Bauhaus not allowing women to do architecture, right? So it was a really interesting period that sometimes we skip in history class, right? And for us it's really important, right? So it generated a lot of iconography also that is really useful for us today, architectons and many symbols that become part of our collective imagination, and you will also see some of these in the exhibition, right? They believe that art and design and architecture can change life, right? So they would go out in the streets and try to change everything, from the trams to the symbols to the ration cards, everything, right? At the same time as this is happening, in Puerto Rico, in the tobacco factories, where workers were denied any means of formal education, some of the workers who could read would read aloud for the other workers, right? At the beginning, it was a practice done by men, right? Especially in Cuba. When it moved to Puerto Rico, right? There's a relationship between the loud reader and the novice, right? These are a drawing by a novice and the loud reader. That's a really interesting parallel. There is this woman that was arrested 2 or 3 times for wearing pants in public. Imagine, right? Women were not allowed to wear pants, and Capetillo was around there wearing pants like for the newspaper. Yesterday, and this is a groundbreaking event, yesterday Penguin Books published one of her manifestos in English. This is the first time in our history, right? So if you go to Amazon or whatever, you can get the book. Before you have to like look in weird libraries to find this document. I think for the first time she will be part of the collective imagination. Capetillo was one of the loud readers, and she was a huge organizer, and apart from being a loud reader, she also used to run a restaurant where she would serve vegetarian meals for workers, even if they didn't have any money, right? So we learned from this legacy of Capetillo, from Juana Colón, that was the daughter of former slaves, that used to sort of collaborate to provide protection for workers. And during COVID, we started a school called the Loud Readers Trade School, right? Where we will invite, and you can go online right now, we will invite speakers, architects, designers, critics, theorists, philosophers, to do workshops and present works that they find important for anybody, basically, like for free, right? So it's a free online architecture school, right? And these are some of the speakers from all around the world, from Africa, Asia, Latin America, people that make books and magazines and do amazing forms of research, right? So it's part of that legacy of the loud reader. Just some of the things that you will find in the page. There are workshops that you can do, many discussions that you can be a part of, and it's a program that is still running, and we hope to continue here in Iowa State, right? As part of this program, and 4 of the works you will see in the exhibition are films by really amazing filmmakers, Cordayeta Henry, based in LA, Liu Jia, based in Beijing, and Pedro Neves Marquez, based in Portugal, working with Sahi Guajajara, that is an indigenous artist from the Amazonas. And they're presenting videos that have to deal with landscapes of exploitation, but also with the indigenous futurism and Afrofuturism. So you will see also those videos in the exhibition. I had the chance also to do like real life loud reading, right, in the streets of Pittsburgh during Black Lives Matter. So it's not just all academic, right? So there's a realm that is going into life, dealing with real activists, right? People that are actually working in the political realm, not only within academia. That also has been really important. And trying to use our platforms as educators to expand those networks of solidarity, right? This is some of the lectures we were doing during our professional practice class, right? So maybe you think of professional practice class as being something where they teach you how to get a license in architecture, right? But we were using also this as an example of how can you be an activist too, right? Not only in architecture, but as an artist, as a designer, right? And we have from the architects like Leslie Loco or Wolf Architects, Brian Celie, that is an architect, also activist too, and Yassiri X, that is an artist and activist, right? So there's all these practitioners, and how Loud Readers allows us to keep on expanding those questions. Loud Readers also becomes a publishing platform that allows to publish Anti-Racist Architecture Manifesto, and later on, a Manual of Anti-Racist Architecture Education. And this became a really important document. It got downloaded like 15,000 times in a week when we published it, right? From people from all around the world. Because it was such a unique document that put into words some of the problems of architectural education, right? From tuition fees, to lack of accessibility, to the actual content we teach, to the interpersonal relations, to student culture. We try to be as comprehensive. And hopefully now when we do the printed version, because this is the digital one, we would like to include one part about precarious labor for teachers, like young faculty and so on, right? So that's part of something that we are also exploring. So then part of the book is to question that legacy of these problematic characters like Walter Gropius and trying to create a form of intersectional diagram of architecture where anti-racism, anti-ableism, transfeminism, anti-capitalism, ecological justice are at the center. How can we intersect all the things that we learn and we study through this spiral, right? How can we keep on learning and growing and revising the forms of knowledge we have, right? How to decenter European epistemologies, Eurocentric epistemologies, right? Europe is not the center of the world, right? Nor the universe. So how can we reflect that in the forms of knowledge we have, right? From indigenous scholars like Nick Estes and Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, subaltern scholars like Gayati Spivak, Sayat Valencia from Mexico, Achille Bembe from South Africa, Frans Fanon from Martinique, right? Michel Foucault and Sloterdijk from Europe, right? But not being at the center of the things we do, right? This is part of the diagram of the manual that centers anti-black regimes around the world, right? Try to understand here with the tuition fees and so on. And most recently, we're about to publish a theory book of architecture as a poetry book, right? It's also one of the collaborations with many of the people that you will see also in the exhibition. Should be out before the end of the year.
Another format of Loud Readers that took place is a studio we taught at Carnegie Mellon, where we asked the students to become contemporary Loud Readers and to think of the campus as a platform for that. So what would be the question that they would be asking, how you can think about collective public programs that could take place there, and develop a series of laboratories that would also question, again, like, what was interesting is that we did this studio before summer 2020, and we could see that the main questions were already there. So for example, Taylor Latime developed a laboratory about the emancipation of blackness through art and through activism. Christopher Elric had this Institute for Protest, where again activism was at the core of the curriculum. Or Crystal Shu questioned the role of social media and all the different technology of surveillance that you can find. Cassandra Howard developed this program in architecture relating to land reparation and to the question of agriculture and local food production. Sichen was also playing with the idea of the American dream and all the different iconographies that come from it. And we also had like the newest part of this campus program that was developed during at the time at Virginia Tech, where we engage in a much larger scale, but also bringing the idea of questioning programs that could take place in the site.
It was during
As-
COVID, so we had to
yeah.
work in a dome.
As public programs, but also with the building. At the end, we also had like an installation that was done in the museum in Plattsburgh, where the students also developed a series of animations about the different events that would take place in their part of their campuses and in their buildings.
That's part.
Workshops for Other Worlds is an experiment on intersectional design processes and collectivist planning.
A través de la ayuda mutua, trabajamos juntos en el desarrollo de esquemas y programas pedagógicos para arquitecturas de educación artística pública, generando pautas para el diseño de formas alternativas de arquitectura, paisajes y planificación urbana.
Sa mga patulaan, mga lektura at talakayan tungkol sa disenyo.
So the idea is that was during COVID too, so on one hand it was difficult because it was COVID and we had to be in a dome with masks and kind of away from each other. But also the museum was empty, so we could take over it. And we have all this chance to somehow use all the digital technology so the students can even explain their projects in their own languages, which I feel is something that also our readers have brought to us. That is this sort of global planetary sort of questioning. In New York, when we were there, we went to the Met and with our students, and we were questioning the colonial footprint of institutions, and then they made us write this piece for the New York architecture, and our students end up also developing a series of really critical projects, some of them that question Columbia University itself, right? So I don't know if we will be invited again, but it was a really fun project to do. Some of the things that they did, one of our students looked for the colonial footprint of the Museum of Modern Art and how the funding of all the board of directors is directly full of blood from Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, and a bunch of the colonies around the world, including her own country of Palestina. The other project was about the Met and the sort of construction of this sort of colonial footprint around the world to the board of directors, but also to the narratives of the rooms. And the very own project of Columbia University and their involvement in the gentrification of Harlem, right, and the construction of some new, we discovered during this project that Columbia University is the biggest real estate developer of New York, right, so it was also very polemic. We were all happy, but also at the same time kind of shocked and surprised and sad and excited. It was a very confusing elevating sort of studio. It was only 2 months, but I feel like we achieved a lot in the way that we all learned so much from how bad these institutions are, very much, right?
We also had the opportunity to develop a lot of different workshops or exchanges with a lot of different types of public. So we like also working a lot with children. Just some examples of different workshops that we developed around the idea of creating their own narrative and using collage and different types of painting techniques to illustrate it. We developed a series of books for children. That's the first one that was called The Story of a Little Girl and the Sun. That was also like already bringing like questions about how to live together, what does it mean, and how can we all become actors into this kind of world-making events. That's an installation we did, which was one also of our favorite projects to do, where we physically had like a lot of different blocks of form, as you can see, and we invited like kids from like toddlers to like more grown-up to come and either work collectively in the space and making together the idea of like new worlds or creating new cities, questioning the idea of program, the idea of space, and also it became like this kind of huge playground, which was a lot of fun also at the end of the day. Part 3, Form and Media, 2008. The limits of my language mean the limits of my world.
And for this, we're going to show you a series of publications and how important are publications for our work and different forms of media. And I show you this picture always because last year particularly, a lot of people were questioning, we have to question our Eurocentric education, we cannot do form anymore. And it's like, but Europeans didn't invent form. Form is a human thing, right? And that's something that we are also really interested in, like, what are the political implications, but also the human conditions of form making, right? So we're really interested in looking at media across many different platforms, from publications to political artifacts to cultural artifacts, right? And try to understand how they all relate and how can we get some intelligence out of it, right? These are some of the books we have published in the recent years in different languages, some of them self-published, some of them published with publishing houses. I think now we have to add like 3 here, but the first exhibition we made in 2011, we commissioned ourselves to do it. So we didn't even know if anybody was going to come to the show. We were in Beijing in a room and we were like making all these collages and projects, and we're like, nobody knows us, so we should make something, right? And we just went, rent a little room in a gallery and made our own exhibition with IKEA tables and some prints we had, right? Later on, we started getting invited to do more institutional exhibitions, like the first Chicago Biennale, where we did these wall manifestos, this one scale. And then most recently, we published our book, Narrative Architecture, a Clinical Manifesto, last year, that deals with the questioning ideology and architecture through representation. A series of collages we have developed to try to understand the history of utopia and ideal urban thinking. Started as a small collage in a magazine, became part of an exhibition in the MAT Museum in Lisbon. Later on, last year actually, we got invited by the newest museum in Nuremberg to make a bigger version and became our largest mural to date. It was like a big piece in a nice show about utopias. Right, so going from the first show that we commissioned ourselves, right? So I think that this is also really good for the students to see that sometimes you are kind of designing where you want to go by mistake, maybe, or on purpose. I love how they match with the collage to the two women there, the same color palette. Right? Again, talking about form, we were also really interested in understanding what's the power of form, how the powerful understand form. And sometimes we are kind of pushed away by our institutions. So like, don't be a formalist, right? Just do something else, be social. We can do both, right? Like, because the powerful understand form, they can use it, right? And we feel like we don't use it because we don't understand the power of it, right? We're just like kind of susceptible to it. So we've been interested in exploring what's the potential of form-making architecture through the history of architecture. Right? We've got a series of collages, between ideologies that get discarded, those forms that get recycled. And we designed this book and we published it with the Artifice Books in Architecture in London in 2013. Right now it's out of print, so if you look for it in Amazon, it costs $900, but it's $10, so don't buy it. Now also we're really happy after many years of working on this. We redesigned the book and we published it this year in China with China Architecture and Building Press. That is the biggest publisher of architecture in China. And because they think that this is a waste of money, they let us do whatever we wanted because they were not going to make any money with it anyways, because they make money with all the graphic standard stuff they sell. So this is like their art book. So it was like really liberatory project to do. So basically the publisher took all the resources and let us do whatever we wanted, and that was it, pretty much. So it's a happy ending story somehow. This is an exhibition we did about it in 2014 in a factory during the Beijing Design Week. You see so it jumps from media, from exhibition, sometimes building, sometimes, if you haven't seen any building yet, but they will come at some point. It got translated into German in 2014 by Cruz, and made a double issue in their 40th year anniversary. They invited us to do a show in Berlin. So we did a show in Berlin. And then we got invited to do a pavilion in the north of Beijing, which we were also following the idea of the shapes as a playground, right? This is a really important book.
published it in 2015, Shapes Iron Text, the Garcia Frankowski Manifesto, and the idea was to explore the idea of language through shapes and through poem. So we also have an art practice, and which we will talk a little bit about it later. And it was really interesting for us because we work both in composition and composition with text.
This poem is really important because you will see it in the exhibition, right? It became a manifesto for us somehow, for Postnovis. It's the sound of the future, she said. And then form making becomes part of this practice that goes into paper, goes into larger scale, becomes objects, becomes installation, becomes poetry, becomes sound, becomes space. Some of the symbols you may recognize, right, from that novice practice, so we are always working with historical content in a way. The last part.
And our last part, platform, spaces for pedagogy. Since each of us was several, we were already quite a crowd.
That's a quote by the youth. And we'll tell you this story that is going to sound exciting, then you're going to hear about heartbreak, then we're going to get a little bit happier, right? So in 2015, both of us submitted a competition project to design the largest museum in Russia. That was a 500,000 square feet art center. Somehow we got into the final out of 10 people, right? There were 5 really famous studios, Miguel Sobejano, Alejandro Aravena, 51&4E, and Office Kasten Gears, David Van Seveden, Stephen Hall, and Hennegan Peng. Did I say Hennegan Peng already? No, whatever. Those were the 5 studios, and then there were 4 Russian studios and us. Nobody knew who we were, right? So we arrived there, and all of a sudden we have this project. It's going to be the first museum in Russia that is not in the center of the city, right? So it's out there in a former landing strip for jets, military jets. And it was going to be in front of the largest shopping mall in Europe, which for us was a great opportunity to bring the normal passerby and pass them to the museum on voluntarily, right? Like that sort of way of hijacking you into participating with art, right? So we proposed a museum where the galleries were going to be in the upper levels, and the ground level was going to be kind of open museum where you can walk through open outdoor galleries, atelier space, and so on. Right? So this is a picture of the model, the structure, right? It has all the galleries in these halls on top of the as bridges. In the ground, you have all the artist residence, all the collections, the artist studios, the concert hall, and so on. Right, so at the end you end up with a structure like this. So you have to understand, right? We are a studio of 2 people, so we have to produce all the documents ourselves, while everybody has like employees and so on. It was a really good fee, maybe not so good for an architecture studio that has 20 employees, but for 2 people it was like, wow, this is like, if we manage to build this, we retire next year. So these are some of the images we generated, right, to sort of this pre-COVID or post-COVID in some other places, of these open spaces and everybody gathering together, right, to see how this can transform as an urban space. And this is the museum when you don't pay the ticket, right? You're just passing by. So the idea for us was to open the museum as a form of urban condition. These are the artist studios for the residencies, one of the libraries, the children's center, one of the lobbies, and the galleries, right? The galleries above in the upper levels, right? So we didn't win the competition at the end, right? We were one of the 10 finalists because they pay our fee, they flew us twice to Moscow, and then at the end it's really political, everything complicated. We didn't win. The client wanted a building that was a tower because it was an icon, which we thought it was stupid. It was going to close the thing, you have to pay a ticket. At the end, the project was too expensive, they canceled it, haha, they didn't win, so it doesn't matter, right? The idea is that when we finished this project, we were truly heartbroken. Like, I literally wanted to retire to the countryside and raise some chickens. I was like, this is the end of the road. That's the only chance we ever gonna get to do anything at this scale or anything, right? Like, first of all, competitions don't happen like this, where somebody allows a nobody to make a project and get into the final. Usually, it's like filtered through, like, they have to know who you are, you apply through a pre-qualifying process. Here it was split between project and portfolio. So somehow, the Cabestrelka had figured out a system that allows the possibility of people that were not established yet to compete with the big shots, right? So we thought that it was a missed opportunity. We missed when we lost. Some of the consultants of museums came to us and told us, we gave you all the balls, we thought your project was the best, which doesn't make it any better, right? It's like, you feel more miserable after that. We went back to Beijing, we made a project called the Palace of Failed Optimism, and it was a building that grows exponentially because it's full of things that fail, so it's always growing, whatever. So that was the crying moment. And after that, we were thinking, like, I cannot be like this all the time because, it's not really fun. So we said, can we do this museum with no budget in Beijing? And then we asked an agent to show us, can you show us a room with no windows and a high ceiling in the middle of the city? And then she said, like, why would you want such a space? It's like, we want to open a gallery there, right? So then we found a small space, and then we started to run a program that we call Intelligentsia Gallery. And the idea was, we're going to make one exhibition, and if nobody likes it, we just turn the gallery into our studio, right? So then it's like, nobody will know that we failed, right? It's just like, make an exhibition, terrible, nobody comes, and then we just keep on doing other stuff like nothing happened, right? So we made the first show, and there was a lot of people, and the media was writing about it, and then it became one show every month, a solo show every month, and then it became like there were like 12 little spaces that open around hours, right? In Beijing, most of the art spaces are in the periphery of the city, in a space called 798 that used to be a former factory compound. We were in the center of the city in the hutons, that are the courtyard houses, right, the former courtyard houses. And we were doing group shows with artists from all around the world, from China, from Africa, from Asia, from whatever, and always like trying to ask critical questions about whatever, right? So these are some of the pictures of the first exhibitions. It became really like a thing. Media will write about it all the time. In a way, it changed our lives because it opens a completely different realm of forms of knowledge and practice for us, right? The people we met, we will make all these huge group shows. This is the second year anniversary of the gallery. It was a salon hanging. As you can see, the amount of artists there in a really small space, it was 180 square feet, right? It became, these are some of the events that happened there. Then we started getting invited. We did a 35 solo show in 35 days event once. To deal with the body ontologies, these African artists from Senegal, working with one of the most important painters in Beijing, so it was really interesting group shows. Here's some of the pictures. Then we started getting invited by larger institutions to do museum shows in their museums, right? It became such a hot commodity. It was an anti-profit space, so if the artists would sell work, we wouldn't take any commission. We were really ideological in the sense that this is not a commercial space, right? Good if you can sell something, good for you, but this is just for the purity of the discourse, right? And we started making all these really big exhibitions in larger institutions, this one that has to deal with language.
I also just wanted to add that for us, being like an anti-profit gallery was very important, because for us what was the main focus is really to bring people, bring people together. This was like before the loud reading practice, but it could be a form of loud reading too, because the idea is really to have the freedom for everyone to speak about their work without thinking of the commercial aspects. So at the beginning it was really important to have also mainly group shows, and always as a rule to have people from everywhere, because what we wanted is to open the communication between the different art pieces and offer also a critique to the art world that tend to separate artists per also where people come from. And for us, we really wanted to engage in a new way of speaking about the works.
And as you can see, some of the exhibitions, they age well. This is 2015, and we were talking about the same things that we're still talking about now, right? Like police brutality, ideology, and infrastructures, and so on. So it's a really interesting opportunity, and we get exhibitions that relate to the ones that we'll see today, like this one called 010, architectural photographers, designers, poets, internet artists, and then the last project we wanted to show to you before we go to the exhibition.
So that's one of the latest projects we worked on, which was located in Nebraska, but also with the idea of having an exchange, let's say, with Nigeria. We developed this project in collaboration with the director of the international business program in the ActUNL, and he really wanted to start a new model for a school. So also that's really fundamental in our practice, is how to think about education. Like we engage in education. Education is a big part also of what we want to do. And he wanted to create a school, a boarding school, that would take place again in Nebraska and in Nigeria, and have an exchange between the two. But what was really interesting for us is that the idea was to have agriculture and land, so again relationship to landscape, in the center of the curriculum, and also bring a component of art. So how we approach the project, knowing that it could take different locations, was thinking more in a modular way, so that's why we also exploded all the programs, and always think of the relationship with the exterior. So have a series of courtyards, series of opening, and also think of the scale of a project that also could develop in many different ways. So that's also like some images of it in different seasons, and understanding how, again, like relationship to the land, the growing of your own food, local food, relationship to agriculture, relationship to art, can really help us to challenge what the curriculum is, and think of spaces where art, different kinds of exchanges that wouldn't be the type of like hierarchical settings, but can be a lot discussed in the settings of education spaces and school spaces, and how can this take place in all the different pavilions that could be as flexible as possible, and again really engaging with the idea of always having this relationship between the outdoor, the seasons, the land, the earth.
That's all.